Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 101. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. There are certainly quite a lot of autoimmune diseases and there are many companies that have dedicated themselves to finding new treatment options. Some diseases have very few options currently, and this week on the podcast we're talking about two of them in a conversation with Priovant's CEO, Benjamin Zimmer. The diseases are dermatomyositis and non-infectious uveitis, and we talk not only about those diseases, but also current treatments, potential options, and how Priovant's Brepocitinib is making a difference. So I guess the first question is if you could give me a bit of background on the company.
We were established in 2021, so relatively recent company with a vision really of developing new treatments for rare autoimmune disease. I think pharmaceutical innovation in autoimmune disease has focused a lot on, finding the next drug for the same set of large market indications, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, diseases like that. And we're certainly not the only company focused on more rare diseases, but I would say we're part of a cohort of companies that's at the vanguard of that and excited to be that. The company was set up as a partnership between Priovant Sciences, which is a group of biotechs you may be familiar with, and Pfizer. And as part of that, Pfizer contributed to Priovant Brepocitinib, which is our lead asset, and had been at the time we were launched and has been now even more very thoroughly evaluated today. The drug's generated positive data in 7 completed phase 2 studies. So I think we have kind of a best of both worlds company where we have our corporation is very young and new, and we have a lot of energy and passion that comes with that. But our IP has been, very extensively developed and de-risked, which obviously in biotech is a great luxury and privilege to have. So I think a very nice kind of combination there.
Maybe we can talk a little bit before we talk about the treatments and what you're doing with your drugs. You're addressing some really serious diseases. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the actual disease, dermatomyositis, and what it is, how many people have it, the prognosis, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 lead indications we're focused on now. One, as you noted, is dermatomyositis, and then the other is an ocular disease called non-infectious uveitis. In dermatomyositis, where we have a phase 3 trial at Priovant that will be reading out next year, this is a very severe disease of inflammation, primarily of the skin and muscle, though there's a large number of comorbidities that can affect other organ systems, particularly the lungs as well. But a quite debilitating disease, and it's rare but not ultra rare. It affects around 35 to 40,000 adults in the United States. And as I was saying before, quite impactful in terms of the muscle disease, quite debilitating. Some patients end up in wheelchairs because their muscle weakness is so great. Around 33% of patients with the disease require some sort of mobility aid. Around half of patients report falls, which can, obviously have a large number of serious comorbidities, including hospitalization. Dysphagia, where patients have trouble swallowing due to muscle weakness, is another big problem. So the muscle weakness can be very debilitating. And then the skin rashes as well. These are quite painful and disfiguring rashes that can cover large portions of the body with scaling, irritation, a lot of pain involved. And so a very, very debilitating disease. The 5-year mortality has been estimated. Different studies have provided different ranges, but anywhere from 10% up to, in one study, they estimated 30 to 40%. And, that results from some of these comorbidities in terms of falls as well as lung disease and cancer, which can be comorbidities. So, this is a very, very serious disease, very high unmet need. when you think about it, it's, not biologically, but in terms of patient impact, sort of cancer-like in terms of just how desperate the patients are for new treatments. And then non-infectious uveitis, the other lead indication we're pursuing. We recently generated some promising phase 2 data and will be entering phase 3 later this year. That affects a few more people. Actually, any kind of non-infectious uveitis affects several 100,000 people in the US, but where we're really focused is on non-anterior uveitis, which means uveitis that affects something beyond just the front of the eye, because the inflammation when it's just in the front of the eye can sometimes be treated with eye drops, and so is a little less burdensome. But when you have it in the intermediate or back areas of the eye, you generally require some sort of systemic treatment, and it's a very debilitating disease. Even the non-anterior manifestations of the disease affect around 70,000 adults in the US. So again, rare, but not some ultra rare disease. It's actually, uveitis is the fourth leading cause of blindness among working age population in the developed world. Very debilitating, very burdensome disease. And I think this is the sort of area where we're excited to be working.
Sure. What are the current treatments for both of those conditions?
So for dermatomyositis, there's really almost nothing available. The only approved drugs for the indication are steroids and different steroidal treatments, and then intravenous immunoglobulin, which is a sort of transplant of immunoglobulin into patients. Very burdensome procedure. It requires infusions that are several hours per day, several days per week, 1 week per month. So, quite burdensome in infusion regimen. And also, although it definitely can help a number of patients, is associated with often a lot of serious side effects. So you see patients being treated with that, and then also just a lot of patients on high dose steroids and your kind of general immunosuppressants in rheumatology like methotrexate, mycophenolate, azathioprine, which are actually not formally approved for dermatomyositis, but are often used given the absence of good treatments available. In non-infectious uveitis, Humira is approved, and obviously a very successful drug overall. Its efficacy in uveitis is more limited. I wouldn't say it's one of the disease areas where Humira has the best benefits, but it is available to patients as a modern targeted therapy. Based on the data we saw in our phase 2 study, it suggests a potential product profile that could be more beneficial to patients than what we've seen from Humira, but obviously comparing a phase 2 study to an approved drug should be done with all due qualifications, and so that's why we're studying it further to confirm that.
What is Brepocitinib and how does it work?
So Brepocitinib is first of all, it's a once daily oral treatment. So I think, that alone, I think, is something that is, very differentiating and promising to patients in these diseases, where both among the approved drugs and even among the other drugs under investigation, there's very limited oral options. The drug's a dual inhibitor of TYK2 and JAK1. It acts on the JAK-STAT pathway, which is a pathway involved in the transduction of different inflammatory cytokines. So the inflammatory cytokines are, involved in immune cell signaling, and the transduction is kind of how the messages from a cytokine actually gets kind of communicated to the nucleus of the cell to then affect a change in the immune cell's behavior. And there's 4 different isoforms of these JAK enzymes: JAK1, JAK2, JAK3, and then you might think JAK4, but instead TYK2 is the 4th one. And the way the transduction works is different combinations of 2 different pairwise combinations of isoforms are involved in the signal transduction of different cytokines. So acting on the JAK-STAT pathway can be a quite potent way for a molecule to still be a targeted molecule, but actually affect multiple inflammatory cytokines. So there actually are a number of drugs that act on this pathway that are already approved. Xeljanz is one of them, actually a Pfizer drug. Rinvoq is another one. So TYK2 is a more recent approval, and there's a number of others as well. But none of them are dual selective inhibitors of JAK1 and TYK2 specifically. And that gives us that particular selectivity for those two isoforms, gives us a uniquely powerful, and in our view, kind of set of cytokines that we in turn suppress. So through JAK1, we're able to suppress interferon gamma, interleukin 6, a number of other cytokines linked to autoimmunity. And then through TYK2, we're able to suppress IL-12 and 23, and really to kind of get all of those at once, you kind of need this particular selectivity to these two isoforms. And then actually type 1 interferon, which is very involved in dermatomyositis, both JAK1 and TYK2 are involved in the signaling of that. So we're able to get particularly potent suppression of that. And so the mechanism really aligns well in that sense with these diseases we're focused on, because one of the reasons these diseases are so burdensome on patients is that they're highly inflammatory with multiple pathogenic cytokines, multiple inflammatory axes. And so our hypothesis, which, the data we have so far has certainly supported, is that this mechanism is really optimally suited for these diseases. So we can kind of create this perfect storm of very high unmet need, not a lot of drugs approved, not a lot of drugs or oral drugs in development, and then a mechanism that's really particularly optimized for these highly inflammatory indications.
You mentioned that there's not a lot of treatments out there. Are there other different kinds of treatments being developed anywhere to tackle these diseases?
Yes, certainly. I think in dermatomyositis, it's interesting. When we started kind of in around 2021 working on this, I would have said the answer is there's not that much. And we were, I think, kind of at the vanguard of that. Since that time, there's actually been a tremendous amount of research interest in dermatomyositis and myositis more generally. Both Pfizer and AstraZeneca have antibodies that are in or approaching phase 3 studies. The FcRns, which are a mechanism that have been used in certain other autoimmune diseases. Argenx and Johnson & Johnson both have those that are in sort of mid-stage studies right now, and then a number of kind of earlier stage proof of concept studies that have been initiated. So I think it's a sign that a lot of pharma companies are starting to appreciate what we did, which is that this is a really significant unmet need and a promising opportunity for a drug. I think Brepocitinib is distinguished from these in a number of ways. As I mentioned before, it's an oral therapy, which none of the other drugs in late stage development are. I also think, we're probably kind of first in the pack in terms of timeline to potential approval, with our phase 3 study reading out next year. I think a lot of the other studies are either kind of in the earlier stages of enrolling their phase 3s or have more phase 2 proof of concept data coming out sooner. And as I said before, I think our mechanism is very well suited to dermatomyositis, given, it is a highly inflammatory indication with multiple pathogenic cytokines. So, for instance, both the Pfizer and AstraZeneca drugs target type 1 interferon, which is very important in dermatomyositis, but they don't touch type 2 interferon, which is also important. And Brepocitinib, for the reasons I was mentioning before, is able to suppress both of those cytokines. So I think, if anything, it's kind of exciting and promising that a lot of other pharma companies have turned their attention here. I think it's validating that the market opportunity and unmet need is real. I think it's, obviously great for patients to, have as many options as they can and as much research going into the space as possible. But I think we're very well positioned to be one of the leading treatments here.
And you already mentioned Pfizer. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about the partnership with them.
Yeah, so obviously they have a different drug in development for dermatomyositis, as I mentioned. That's not related to our partnership. I think, as I mentioned kind of in the history of the company, we were really set up as a partnership between Roivant Sciences and Pfizer. And I think that you've seen, I think is, kind of part of Pfizer's R&D strategy and business strategy, like a kind of research and development externalization approach where they, for certain drugs that they're excited about, but for various reasons think could be better developed through smaller biotechs, will partner to kind of spin those out into new standalone biotech companies that Pfizer is a significant minority owner of, but is, not that involved operationally necessarily, like SpringWorks Therapeutics, which is now a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company in the oncology space, is a good example of that. Roivant and Pfizer actually had a second similar collaboration called Telavant as well. So as part of that, they're a significant minority shareholder of the company, have a seat on the board, and kind of work very closely in giving us a lot of strategic guidance, which is quite helpful. And great to kind of be able to pick the brains, obviously, of that very large human capital filled organization. But I think in a nice way too, Priovant was really set up to be a fully independent company, and Pfizer's a shareholder in the same way that a venture fund would be a shareholder, providing a lot of great strategic guidance. But we're still able to operate very nimbly and quickly in execution without kind of having to go through hurdles and in collaboration with them. There's no joint development committee or anything like that.
I wonder if you could move on to your studies and clinical trials now, if you could tell me a bit about the Neptune study.
Yeah, so this was the study in non-infectious uveitis that read out earlier this year. So that was a result we were very excited about for a few reasons. First of all, just a bit about kind of the treatment paradigm in uveitis. Because this is, an eye disease, can lead to blindness. When patients are experiencing symptoms, very aggressive treatment for, obvious reasons. So the standard way that physicians treat the disease is they do an oral steroid burst that's very high, often 60 milligrams per day. If you're familiar with other autoimmune diseases, that's extremely high. Generally, anything above 20 milligrams per day would be considered very, very high. That's obviously a steroid burst. It's not administered chronically. So they do that to get the inflammation under control. And then what the physicians are looking for is like, okay, how do we get rid of the steroids and replace them with something more sustainable over time? And so generally the model of study in non-infectious uveitis is to do one of these steroid bursts administered concurrently with the investigational drug, and then taper the steroids and kind of see basically how long you have, sustained benefit, or the endpoint that's generally measured is actually treatment failure. So basically, how long can you prevent treatment failure? And one of the interesting things we did in study design is we did a much more aggressive steroid taper than has been seen in past trials, including the Humira approval trials. So our study involved a 2-week burst followed by a 6-week taper, which is very, very quick. In past studies, the taper had been about 13 weeks after the 2-week burst. So we actually kind of held our drug to a much higher standard. And in spite of that, we actually got much lower treatment failure rates from Brepocitinib. So our treatment failure rates for Brepocitinib 45 milligrams seen in this study was below 30% at 6 months. We need to run the phase 3 to confirm it, but I think a very promising result that in spite of a more aggressive steroid taper, we were able to do a much better job of preventing treatment failure. So yeah, very excited about that. And then we are very, very actively working right now to get ready to initiate the phase 3 study later this year and be off to the races with that to hopefully get the drug approved as quickly as possible.
So what are the sort of the next steps and the timeline for the clinical trials for both of the diseases?
In uveitis, coming out of the Neptune study, as I mentioned, we're kind of full speed ahead into phase 3. We're currently actively engaging with FDA as part of the end of phase 2 process to align with them and get their input on a registration supportive phase 3 program. I think we should have that, quite soon. And then on the back of that, our plan is to start dosing patients by the end of the year. And I think, we should have more precise timelines on that once we kind of know the exact final study design coming out of the FDA engagement, though certainly the basic principle is going to be to not change too much from phase 2 because, something worked well once. Don't fix what isn't broken. In dermatomyositis, we have a study called the Valor study. This is actually set out to enroll the largest interventional clinical trial ever conducted in myositis with this study. So it's designed as a single phase 3 study to support registration, to support approval. Tests 2 doses of Brepocitinib, 15 milligrams and 30 milligrams against placebo. The enrollment target was approximately 225 patients, which again is significantly larger than has ever been undertaken. We actually have been able to enroll that study for a rare disease and for a study given its size fairly quickly. Our kind of total enrollment timeline will be around 2 years. The study is on the verge of being fully enrolled. It will be fully enrolled this summer. We'll kind of formally announce that once it's complete. And then that's a 1-year primary endpoint. So that data would be coming out sometime in the second half of 2025. And, as I mentioned, a significant undertaking around the largest interventional dermatomyositis study ever conducted. And it's actually a space where some of the smaller studies have struggled to enroll. So I think the fact that ours did it the way it did is a sign of the enthusiasm that the medical community has around our drug. So yeah, very promising. We're very excited about that. And that will obviously be, looking ahead to next year, a very major milestone, both for our company and I think, for the myositis research field overall in terms of the readout of that study. And again, because it's such a large study in a rare disease, our plan is following that to most likely, assuming the data is very good, as we hope and expect it will be, to move ahead with an NDA filing and could potentially have the drug on the market not that far after that. So I think very, very exciting opportunities in both of these diseases and in terms of kind of upcoming milestones and timelines.
Definitely good news. Has it been a challenge to find the right people for these studies?
It's interesting in rheumatology and particularly these kind of rarer rheumatologic indications. And I'm about to describe as part of what I find fun about it, but it certainly doesn't make it easy, is, first of all, these are heterogeneous diseases. So if you think about something like dermatomyositis, there's different organ systems involved. Some patients might have really bad muscle disease and more modest skin disease. Other patients might have the opposite. Some might have lung involvement. Others don't have lung involvement. So the symptom presentation is very heterogeneous. And then the background medications they're on are quite heterogeneous too. I think in general in rheumatology, treatment paradigms are not quite as rigid as an area like oncology, where there's kind of very formal lines of therapy. I think in rheumatology, especially for rare diseases, it's kind of a lot more done at the discretion of the particular treating physician. And that's particularly true for something like dermatomyositis, where there can't really be super formal treatment guidelines because there's so little approved to begin with. So I mentioned like the rheumatic immunosuppressants like methotrexate, mycophenolate, azathioprine. These drugs are used widely in DM, but are not formally approved. So different doctors will have different ones that they prefer and kind of use in different ways. There's different regional variants. IVIG, as I mentioned before, is used very unevenly because it does provide some benefit to patients, but the side effects are so great and the infusion regimen is so burdensome, a lot of patients and physicians don't like it. So, the patients kind of come into these trials with heterogeneous symptoms and heterogeneous background medications. And so in designing a trial, you need to balance kind of meeting the field where it is, but also with the fact that you're trying to run a controlled experiment. And in running a controlled experiment, you want to minimize noise and minimize heterogeneity other than your control variable, which is drug versus placebo. So it is quite challenging in spite of the fact that there actually are, for a rare disease, a lot of patients affected and they do desperately need new treatments. I think, a lot of companies have found it a challenging space to enroll, and some have struggled more than others. I think, we've put a lot of effort in as our company to really building relationships with the physicians in the space and really partner with them to kind of find a way operationally to really make this work. And then again, I do think it also speaks again to how promising the drug is and the fact that physicians are very excited about, its potential and really want to put in the effort to getting the study done. And I think patients too, as they hear about the drug's potential, want to contribute to research. Again, I think the idea of enrolling in a study for an oral drug is definitely appealing to patients, even though there's a chance that they might be on placebo. Definitely has been a challenge for us, a challenge for the field, but we're excited to be coming out now on the other end of that and looking ahead now to the data readout.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
The only other thing I would add is I think dermatomyositis and non-infectious uveitis, though very, very significant unmet needs and very significant opportunities for us as a result, to me are really just the beginning. And I think there's actually a lot of other diseases that kind of fit the same general category, these kind of large, rare but larger rare, sounds like an oxymoron, but like a large orphan indication as opposed to an ultra rare disease. And there's a number of these that kind of fit this similar prototype of no modern drugs really approved or very few modern drugs approved, very high unmet need, very high amounts of inflammation with multiple inflammatory pathways where a dual TYK2 JAK1 inhibitor is particularly appropriate or exciting as a potential mechanism of action. And so we're currently evaluating a large number of these to kind of assess which ones we want to initiate additional development programs into. So I think that's another exciting upcoming thing to stay tuned for.
An enjoyable interview there about how Priovant is making a difference in the fight against autoimmune disease, and definitely there's real hope for the future for patients, which is always the bottom line. So don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.